They said it would be over in a few short weeks. They said we'd be marching through Paris, but they never said it would be anything like this. The Kaiser, Hindenburg, Ludendorff, they're all liars.
By early September 1914, the German advance had reached within 30 miles of the French capital. Executing a modified version of the Schlieffen Plan, designed to quickly attack France through neutral Belgium, before turning southwards to encircle the French army on the border, the Germans had made significant inroads into enemy territory.
But after a series of successful counter-offensives by the British and French forces, the Germans were forced to retreat and ultimately dug in north of the Aisne River. This signalled an end to mobile warfare and an introduction to stalemate.
In this episode, I'm joining the Imperial German Army on the Western Front, where I'll find out whether conditions were any different to those on the opposing side of no man's land.
They would have had workable electricity, toilets, a stark contrast from the Allies.
How new, ingenious strategies would shape your experience on the battlefield.
Specialist miners would then dig tunnels up to 12 miles long.
And determine your chances of survival.
The first troops they launched against thought it was a smokescreen. You can combat these tanks, you can stop these tanks, you stand your ground, you can defeat these things.
So the question is, could you survive the trenches as a German soldier during the First World War? The defeat of the German army at the First Battle of the Marne in the late summer of 1914 crushed any hopes of a march on the French capital. The Schlieffen Plan had failed, and the decision was made to dig a solid line roughly 50 kilometers north of where they had reached in early September. In the following months, once the German positions were being established, both the German and Franco-British armies would continuously attempt to outflank one another, creeping closer and closer to the North Sea. The race to the sea, as it became known, extended the front lines all the way from the Belgian coast at Nieuport to the Swiss frontier. In Germany, compulsory military service had been the norm since long before the war. In 1914, civilians would be expected to serve a minimum of 2 or 3 years in training and active service from the age of 20. After this, they would return to civilian life, but could be reconscripted in the event of a war up to the age of 45. By maintaining such a large pool of trained men, the German army had the ability to rapidly mobilise and expand its size. In the first year of the war, within 12 days, it had grown from 800,000 to 3.5 million men. Equipped with a basic uniform, rifle and Pickelhaube, the iconic leather-spiked helmet used in the first 2 years of the war, I was ready to enter the front lines, to protect the fatherland.
So, Dickie, here I am, the Kaiser's Iron Youth of Germany. How accurate would it be to say that at this point in the war, 1914, the German volunteers, they're full of optimism and enthusiasm, aren't they?
Of course they are. The Germans can't wait to get to the front. They're going to be scared that it's going to be finished, over, ended by Christmas.
Too soon.
Absolutely. They want to be at the front. They're full of enthusiasm like our recruits are.
And in 1914, they would have been dressed in what I'm wearing right now. Talk to me a bit about the uniform I'm wearing at the moment.
Okay, so what you've got is the early war German uniform. So if we start at the bottom, down here we've got the jack boots. Very different to what the British are wearing. The British are wearing ankle boots with puttees. No puttees here.
Right, okay. And then coming up, we've got this grade outfit. Was that what they were wearing all the way back in the 19th century?
Well, yeah, essentially what you've got there is a Napoleonic Wars uniform. It's been updated, it's a field grey colour. A few years before the First World War, the Germans are still wearing blue uniforms, rather like the French. The French, at the start of the First World War, are wearing this glorious uniform that would be, wouldn't be out of place on a New York catwalk. So they're wearing these bright red trousers, these pantalon rouge, this beautiful blue tunic, and the képi rouge as well, a red hat as well. We've come more up to date here in the German army. We've got a grey uniform that blends in a lot better.
You mentioned what the French were wearing on their heads. I mean, the elephant in the room here is this helmet here, the Pickelhaube. Why on earth were German soldiers wearing a big old spike on top of their helmets at the start of the war?
Well, it's not like what many people think. The Germans didn't charge at the enemy like that with their spike. The Pickelhaube, or to give it its official German name, the Lederhelmspitze, the leather helmet with the spike or the point. The idea behind the point at the top there is if you've got cavalry with sabres bearing down on you and they thrust the sabre at you, it's going to cause it to blow down one side, and then straight into a rolled blanket that you'd have across here.
So it comes from this sort of Prussian army influence, doesn't it? So it's still harping back to the 19th century, cavalry charges.
Absolutely.
You don't see many of them as the war progresses, but at the start of the war, perhaps.
Yes, I mean, yeah, it is. But also, we think of this as a very German piece of headgear. If you're looking at what the British Army is wearing in the 1880s and the 1890s, they're wearing the Home Service helmet, which is a felt helmet, and it has a point on the top as well.
Right,
so we copied the Germans in that style as well.
And talk to me about the rest of my equipment. How does this differ from the British? What do we have on us?
Well, essentially, I'm no fan of this equipment. It's very difficult to put on. It always falls to bits. It's very different to the British equipment. Essentially what you've got here are ammunition pouches here for charges. You've got 60 rounds on this side and 60 rounds on this side. So you've got 120 in total.
Right.
Compare that to 150 the British soldier is wearing. If you spin around for just a second, give us a twirl. You've got a water bottle at the back there.
Yep.
You've got something called a bread bag here for your rations and your personal bits and pieces. And on the far side here, you have your bayonet as well.
Okay. Wow. It's a lot thicker than the British?
Yeah, it's called the butcher's blade bayonet, basically because it looks the same profile as a blade that butchers would use. There were some other versions. There was a Pioneer version which had saw teeth in the back of it, and that was supposed to be used as a pioneer tool for pioneers to cut wood with. But we really went on the propaganda for that one. Look at their horrendous German bayonets, designed purely to make wounds even worse.
And of course, Dickie, you mentioned the ammunition, 7.92 rounds, as we come over to what they would have been fed into, the Mauser Gewehr 98.
Yes.
Staple rifle for every German soldier.
Yes.
And so this rifle's interesting because the bolt and action replicated worldwide. It's a very popular rifle. It performs excellently in the Boer War, but perhaps it's not ideally suited to trench warfare, is it?
Well, if you look at the overall length of it, and then if you add on one of these things here,
yeah, the
bayonet to
which
the front.
we've just seen.
Okay, if you're working your way through a trench system like this, this is a very long weapon.
So what it has in firepower and a reliability, it lacks in mobility.
Yes, absolutely. If you compare it to the short magazine Lee Enfield, that's much better suited to these trench conditions. But also another thing that isn't really suited is the way you fire it. The bolt is out the side.
Yes, I noticed.
Okay,
Yeah.
so with the Lee Enfield, the bolt is cocked down. With this one, if you bring it up to the shoulder and cock it and bring it back, you'll smack yourself in the face. So you have to lower it away from your face to reload it. With the Lee Enfield, you can just carry on cycling the bolts and firing continually until you're out of ammunition.
Another disadvantage with the Germans' primary weapon was its ammo capacity. Only able to hold 5 rounds in its chamber, the Mauser was seen as an inferior rifle compared to its British counterpart, which could hold a 10-round box magazine. But the bolt-action rifle was certainly not the only weapon the German army had in its arsenal.
At this point in the war, 1914-15, what other types of weapons did the Germans have to defend themselves or assault enemy trenches?
Okay, so they've got a whole variety of different hand grenades. So they range from things like the Kugel, which is a large bomb-shaped one, which is more of a sort of defensive grenade that you kind of throw out of a fortification. You drop it because it's so large that you couldn't really get away from the shrapnel radius.
Right,
You've got things like the discus grenade, which you throw, well, like a discus. Terrible design because it has detonators on the side of it which have to land for it to detonate. You've got a very small grenade, an anti-personnel grenade called the egg grenade, the Einhandsgranate, which is, it looks like an egg, so it's called the egg grenade. Possibly one of the most famous grenades that Germans have is something called the stick grenade or the Stielhandgranate. Okay, you've got a large long piece of wood and the grenade on the end. You have a porcelain ball on the end of it. You pull that out and pull a string which goes up through the handle, and then it detonates within a few seconds. You've got leverage on your side so you can throw it a lot further.
Of course, yes. Yeah, and so that's the one that they're using that throughout the entire war, aren't they? And you almost see like a similar version during the Second World War.
Very similar, yes.
And as well as rifles and grenades, they've of course got this beast here, the MG08. Now, this really is the bane of the British Army, isn't it?
Yes. It's a cracking machine gun. It's has the same caliber of rounds, the 7.92, as the Mauser fires. You can use it in various different ways. You can use it offensively and defensively. What the Germans would do is set their barbed wire up, and so it'd funnel in the Tommies and the French into killing zones in front of these machine guns.
Where they'd have this thing firing at what sort of a rate of fire does this
We're talking about 450 rounds a minute.
Wow. In terms of portability, does it need a crew behind it? Who would be designated as the machine gunner?
Yeah, obviously you'd have a crew to fire it. You have your main machine gunner, the person who's firing it, but also you'll have others feeding in the bullets, the rounds in here, and to keep it going. You've also got to keep it topped up with water. This machine gun is water cooled. Okay,
right,
if you fire a machine gun without it being water cooled or air cooled, it's going to overheat. So round here you can see you've got a massive big fat jacket. This will be filled with water. As you fire the machine gun, the barrel will get hot. Right. And hopefully the water in here will stop it getting so hot. That is very similar to the Vickers machine gun as well.
And you mentioned the mobility of this weapon. You can set it up on its bipod, and you can also move direction, can't you?
Absolutely. So it's a very versatile weapon. It's not fixed in one position. You can bring it up here, and then you can move the machine gun to where you need it.
It's incredibly advanced for the time, isn't it?
Yeah, it's where machine guns were going in the future, I suppose.
And you can imagine this thing responsible for so many casualties of the British. It must have been absolutely devastated, not just to be on the receiving end, but to be the one firing this weapon.
The deadliness of the German machine gun was enhanced by the design of the trenches in which they were positioned. In contrast to the British trenches, the German lines were often more sophisticated and elaborate, dug at least 12 feet deep, on high ground and reinforced with concrete and steel beams. Purpose-built pillboxes were constructed to protect key machine gun positions from enemy fire and artillery bombardment. More willing to stay put and defend the territory they had already captured, the German army designed their networks with a greater attention to detail. When possible, built in a zigzag shape to limit the damage of shell explosions, and constructed with proper drainage systems to prevent flooding.
And it wasn't just the key machine gun, mortar and communication positions that were well fortified. Some of the living quarters away from the front line were dug 50 feet underground. Reinforced by concrete, these could have potentially housed hundreds of beds. They would have had electricity, workable toilets, a stark contrast from the open-air trenches of the Allies. And this would have given soldiers peace of mind, confidence, a relative safe haven in which they could enjoy some downtime, sing songs, play games, and of course, enjoy their rations.
When the war began, the standard daily ration for German troops included some bread, egg or field biscuits known as Hartkeks, preserved meat often in the form of a Erbwurst or pea sausage, potatoes and vegetables, all to be soaked down with some coffee mixed with sugar. They were also provided with 2 cigars and 2 cigarettes. Whilst beer and wine was provided to the troops in the Bavarian army, German High Command deemed alcohol dangerous as it made soldiers coarse and stupid. The iron portion issued to troops in the field consisted of 3 daily portions of 250 grams of field biscuit, 200 grams of preserved meat or 170 grams of bacon, 150 grams of preserved vegetables, 25 grams of coffee and 25 grams of salt. The amount of meat in the ration steadily decreased as the war went on. By 1917, meat was present in only a third of meals. Even potatoes became scarce. By 1918, meat had vanished from the ration entirely. This led many German soldiers behind the lines to supplement their diet by buying or trading with the civilian population of occupied territories.
Whilst rations were still relatively generous in the early years of the war and soldiers were protected in these underground bunkers, morale was high within the Kaiser's army, and you can understand why. You would have almost felt invincible in here. That was until you heard the word gas.
In 1915, at the Battle of Ypres, the German army ushered in a new age of chemical warfare. On the 22nd of April at 5 PM, a wave of asphyxiating gas released from cylinders embedded in the ground by German specialist troops smothered the Allied line on the northern end of the Ypres salient, causing panic and struggle to survive, a new form of weapon. The chlorine gas, which irritated the lung tissue, causing a choking effect that could cause death, forced 2 colonial French divisions north of Ypres from their positions, creating a 5-mile gap in the Allied line defending the city.
A panic-stricken rabble of Turcos and Zouaves, with grey faces and protruding eyeballs, clutching their throats and choking as they ran, many of them dropping in their tracks and lying on the sodden earth, with limbs convulsed and features distorted in death.
But, as ever throughout World War I, when a new weapon was used against the enemy, it was likely to be used against you too.
So Dickie, the Germans are the first ones to launch a lethal poisonous gas attack at Ypres in 1915, but it doesn't take long for the Allies to return the favour.
That's right. The favour was returned at the Battle of Loos in 1915, so later that year. But what the Germans have been doing is, on the 22nd of April 1915, at a place called Bixschoote, which is just up the road from here, the Germans have dug in hundreds of pre-filled cylinders containing chlorine gas.
Right, and they're placing them just outside the trenches?
No, they're putting them by the fire step and digging them in.
Right, okay.
So hundreds of these cylinders. And then what they do is they run a rubber hose up from the top of the cylinder, up into no man's land, pointing at the British and the Allied lines.
Right, and tell me, what are the early warning signs of gas attack? Does it depend on the different type of gas? Are we seeing something? Are we smelling something? What are the earliest warning signs that the Germans can notice?
Well, the first thing you see is it's like a smoke screen rolling across no man's land. That's why they chose chlorine gas, because it's heavier than air. You don't want to choose a gas that's lighter than air because it'll just float away into the atmosphere. And so you need to have something that's heavier than air, so it rolls across. And the first troops they launched it against thought it was a smokescreen.
Right, okay. So does it depend on the type of gas? Does chlorine gas look similar to phosgene gas?
So chlorine gas is a sort of a yellowy green sort of colour. In the poem Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, he talks about seeing under a sea of green, and that's the gas attack, that's the chlorine gas. Phosgene that comes later has the same sort of kind of action as chlorine, but it's invisible. You can't see it.
Oh boy. And let's say you're unfortunate enough to be in the trenches when the enemy launches a gas attack, say at the Battle of Loos. What is this gas doing to the soldiers?
Where do you know chlorine from?
Well, swimming pools.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Smells, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
it gets in your eyes.
So it stings your eyes.
Yeah.
That's because there's a very small amount of chlorine in a massive amount of water. If you're in a gas cloud, you're in a massive amount of chlorine. It's going to get into your eyes. It's going to mix with the water in your eyes and form hydrochloric acid.
Oh, so it reacts with the water.
Absolutely.
Right.
And it burns your eyes. It chemically burns your eyes. You'll breathe it in, and it burns your larynx. It may leave you with something called a gas whisper. It means you may not be able to speak again properly. You'll breathe it down into your lungs, and your lungs will try and defend themselves by excreting liquid. So the gas gets in, it starts dissolving your lungs, and you'll start coughing up your lungs, and it's a horrendous way. If you want to know more about this, read Wilfred Owen's poem, Dulce et Decorum Est. It's a very, very grim and realistic account of a gas attack.
Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone was still yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning.
So Dickie, let's say the worst has happened. The British have released chlorine gas. It's now dissipating into the trenches. The gong has gone off. What do we do then? How do we protect ourselves?
So the first sort of forms of protecting you were using handkerchiefs or socks and urinate on them.
Right.
And urine is very strong in ammonia. Ammonia will neutralise chlorine very effectively.
Okay, so that's where you hear that it was the Canadians, right, who were the first to
Yes.
they pissed on their handkerchiefs. So it actually worked. It's not a myth.
It did actually work. It wasn't terribly effective, but it worked, and it's better than not having that. And I mean, what happens if you can't go for a wee when the gas attack goes off? Every trench would have a bucket of urine in it in case you needed it to put it in and literally put it over your face like that.
And so that was maybe used by the soldiers, I'm guessing, in the first year of the war.
1915,
And then
yes.
they developed some equipment.
So what they did, the British went for a whole range of gas masks, from things like something called a black veil respirator, which is like a pad, and it's soaked in something called hypo solution. Hypo solution is a very strong, kind of vinegary smelling liquid. It's used in film photography. And so if you've ever smelt it, it's a very distinctive smell. You won't ever forget that smell. But these pads are soaked in hypo solution. They're placed over the face like that, and it doesn't, and then you have to protect your eyes, so they issue goggles out. After that, they start issuing out a variety of different smoke hoods, as they call them.
Yes,
and
the PH hood.
It starts off with the hypo hood, which is still soaked in hypo solution, but this will protect you against chlorine. So the Germans now know we're protected against chlorine gas. So they have to use a different gas, and the gas they're using is phosgene. So we need a completely different respirator or a gas mask to protect ourselves from that. And this is where this thing comes in. Okay, what we've got here,
Of course.
is the PH hood, the phenohexamin helmet. Sometimes it's called the tube helmet, because inside here is a small tube that you would place in your mouth like this, and you put a helmet over, and then you breathe in through the fabric and then out through the flutter valve. This is the type of gas mask that Wilfred Owen talks about in his poem Dulce et Decorum Est. He talks about fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, and he's talking about this gas mask, the PH hood.
So this is what the British are using, a very basic sort of design. What do the Germans have?
So what they start off with, again, is pads soaked in chemicals and then to neutralise the gas. But very, very quickly they move on to a proper type of gas mask. And the one you've got on you here is this thing here, containing the tin, and you pull it out. And it's kind of almost like you'd think of a gas mask. Okay, you've got lenses to protect your eyes. You've got a filter.
Yeah, this is different, isn't it?
Absolutely. So inside here, you've got activated carbon in here, and so that would filter out the gases inside.
So the carbon in this respirator, so that stops the chlorine from reacting with the oxygen and the water? Yeah,
it filters out the gas out there, so you can have clean air you breathe in through. Again, if you look at a civilian gas mask of World War II, very, very similar in design. Filter, eyepiece, and a way of putting it on.
Yeah, how would you put it on? And let's talk about how quickly you would have to put it on. If the gas is already coming into the trench, how long do you have?
Seconds, literally seconds. Okay. So what you do, if the gas starts coming in, instantly stop breathing and don't go because then you've breathed in a whole load of it. You stop breathing, you close your eyes, you turn your back on the gas, and you literally will get it straight on like that and into your face like that.
Right,
and then blow out to try and blow out any gas that's got into the gas mask.
So it's designed in a way to be able to put on extremely quickly.
Yes.
In the event of a gas attack.
You have seconds to do that.
And is it true that in 1915, or it may be a myth, was Hitler involved in some sort of gas attack?
Well, he may have been. The current thinking is we hear about Hitler going blind in a gas attack.
Which was possible.
Absolutely, it is possible. But the latest thinking is that it was a psychological blindness that he got. It was almost certainly a German gas that gassed him.
Right, okay. And you mentioned that. It happens to both the British, the French and the Germans. You need to make sure that the weather conditions are correct before you start launching gas attacks.
Absolutely essential. So when the Germans first launched their first gas attack on the 22nd of April 1915, they intend to launch it first thing in the morning, but the wind is blowing the wrong way. And so they have to leave that gas attack until the afternoon. So what you want is a steady breeze straight across, not too fast, because otherwise the gas will blow straight across your enemy and it won't be effective. It'll be gone straight away.
So in a weird way, you need almost like, it feels weird saying this, but you need the Goldilocks zone of a little bit of wind blowing in the right direction, ideally no rain, and that's when it's going to reap havoc in the enemy trenches.
You mentioned rain. I mean, at the moment, this wouldn't be a good time for a gas attack because the gas will get washed out of the air. If it's misty, again, it'll get washed out of the air and it'll be ineffective.
And of course, that's what happens to the British at the Battle of Loos when they launch, when they return the favour to the Germans. Yes. It blows back in their face.
Blows back straight onto their own side. So a bit of an own goal, I suppose.
To avoid catastrophic outcomes when using gas in changeable weather conditions, the German army began to fill artillery shells with gas. The agents, in liquid form in glass bottles, were put inside the shell, which would break on contact and the liquid would evaporate. Shells were colour-coded in a system started by the Germans. Green cross shells contained the pulmonary agents, chlorine, phosphine and diphosphine. This was just one of many ways armies were adapting, and warfare was evolving based on trial and error. Whilst gas struck fear into the enemy as it loomed towards them just over the surface, below the surface, an entirely different kind of war was being fought.
Mining saw a particular resurgence throughout the First World War as army engineers looked to break the stalemate, break the deadlock by digging underneath no man's land and laying a large quantity of explosives beneath enemy trenches. Underground warfare began on Christmas Day 1914 in the La Boisselle sector of the Western Front, with shafts just like these being sunk into the ground. Specialist miners would then descend these and sometimes dig tunnels up to 12 miles long. They might also be trying to dig underneath enemy tunnels coming the other way, and blowing them up is part of a counter-mining strategy.
Unfortunately for the German army, it was the British who struck one of the greatest blows in the war underground. On the 7th of June 1917, to mark the beginning of a new offensive located at the village of Messines in West Flanders, 19 mines were positioned underneath the front lines of the German 4th Army. The evening before the attack, General Sir Charles Harrington, Chief of Staff of the 2nd Army, remarked to the press, "Gentlemen, I don't know whether we are going to make history tomorrow, but at any rate, we shall change geography."
Exactly at 3:10 AM, there was a terrific explosion on our left. It was the blowing up of a mine, which was the signal for everything to start. The next second there was such a roar, the like of which I've never heard before or since, and I hope I never hear such a one again. It was caused by the explosion of a further 18 mines.
An estimated £1 million of ammonal and gun cotton explosives erupted beneath the German line in one of the largest non-nuclear man-made explosions in history.
Reports that the explosions could be heard all the way in London by the Prime Minister David Lloyd George have since been disproved, and the number of German soldiers killed was nowhere near the alleged 10,000. But the mine explosions, accompanied by the artillery barrages, had achieved their intended effect of completely destroying the German positions and causing utter mayhem amongst the infantry units on the ground.
With each year, new weapons and strategies were being tested to try and break the deadlock of static trench warfare, with more often than not the same result: thousands dead in return for small territorial gains and little movement of the front lines. Hope for a breakthrough now rested on a new mobile superweapon. At the Battle of Flers-Courcelette during the Somme Offensive of 1916, Douglas Haig's gigantic alien steel machines had, for the first time ever, rolled across no man's land. Ominous as they may have looked, however, many Mark I tanks were initially rendered useless, getting trapped in uneven terrain, breaking down with engine faults, or easily targeted by precise German artillery fire. Wildly inaccurate and varying German descriptions of the Mark I tank in 1916 also suggest that few soldiers had directly encountered the machines, and if they did, long-range artillery fire had disabled them well before they could make any direct impact. By the penultimate year of the war, as the Allies used more and more tanks along the Western Front, German soldiers became more familiar with the metal monsters, yet still struggled to know how to deal with them.
I fired at it myself, but I could just as well throw peas at it. Only when it was fired at with mines did it turn away and so exposed its flank. A lieutenant from the MGK brought a machine gun and fired at it from close range. It took nearly 2,000 rounds before the beast caught fire.
The jury was evidently still out on the best methods of combating the new threat, but by 1917, the ordinary infantry soldier alone had a new arsenal of weapons and equipment to choose from.
So Dickie, 1917 draws to a close and we still have a stalemate on the Western Front. But that's not for the lack of new equipment and weaponry being introduced, is it? Tell me, how does a German soldier look different in 1918 compared to 1914?
Okay, so we've got a few differences going on. Okay, what we've got is starting at the bottom here, jack boots are now out. We've now got ankle boots and puttees like the British are wearing
right, okay.
From the start of the war. And so often down to things such as shortage in raw materials in Germany. Okay, so you can't get the high leg boots anymore, so we're doing that now. Also, what we've got is a new type of tunic, a simplified one.
Less Victorian.
Yes, more up to date.
Yeah.
More up to date. The equipment has changed slightly, so it's changed in colour, but the big difference is on your head. Gone is that Pickelhaube or the Lederhelm Spitzer. What we've got now is the Stahlhelm from 1916.
Yes, very different design, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. So arguably a much better design than the British Brodie shrapnel helmet. You've got protection at the back of the head,
Yeah.
back here. It protects the face around here. It's a much higher grade steel than the British the Brodie helmet. Also, if you compare this shape to modern combat helmets, such as the Virtus helmet the British Army is now using, it's much more of that shape. So the Germans had to be on a good idea, and it's a good design.
Yeah, it's cumbersome on the head, but I'm sure it would have saved far more lives than the Pickelhaube.
Absolutely.
And it's not just the equipment that's changing. New types of weapons are slowly being introduced towards the end of the war, aren't they?
Certainly. As the war drags on, we're seeing more and more innovative weapons being used. So things such as the flamethrower, it comes in and makes an appearance.
Yeah.
But also, certainly by the end of the war, we're seeing submachine guns being used for the first time.
Right, of course, yeah, you see they're rare, but you see the pictures of the German soldiers by 1918. They've got the MP18, the machine pistol.
Along with the newly introduced MP18 were other unconventional tools and equipment, including the Sappenpanzer, or trench body armour used by machine gunners in exposed positions, and the elephant mask, as it was termed by the British, used by snipers to safely lift their heads above the parapets. Albeit cleverly designed, none of these innovations were to help the Germans combat their latest menace.
And of course the Germans are facing a new threat, aren't they? The tank. What are they doing, apart from just firing their machine guns at it, to combat these metal monsters in the last 2 years of the war?
Okay, so what they're doing is they're bringing down artillery on these slow-moving tanks. Remember, it's not a fast tank. They've only got a top speed of 4 miles an hour, and so you can engage them with your own artillery.
Right,
They're
okay.
using anti-aircraft guns, 20mm anti-aircraft guns to fire at them directly.
And of course the Germans are capturing these vehicles as well.
Yes, so the Germans do capture quite a number of British tanks, and they send them behind their lines. They have their workshop where they have them refitted and repurposed. They make some changes to them, changes to the armament, that sort of thing, and then they launch them again against their original owners. And they have also developed a new monster of a rifle. Check this out.
Holy moly.
It's not bad, is it?
Wow, how big is this?
Big.
Yes. So this is, I'm assuming, some sort of anti-tank rifle.
Yes, so the Germans introduced this. Essentially what it is a scaled up Mauser rifle. It's firing these things here, okay?
Wow.
This is a 13.2mm round. Essentially, it's almost the same size as a 50 cal round that you
Right.
see in Browning machine guns in the Second World War.
Well, I can't even imagine trying to fire this thing. I don't suppose that they're leaning into this. They're probably having to fire on the ground.
Yeah, you couldn't fire this thing standing up. You have to have it prone. You'd have somebody firing it, but also you'd have a spotter next to you looking for any targets of opportunity. To load it, you're opening up the bolt like that, bringing it back in, and each time you'd be putting in a
One of
round
these.
like that,
Yeah.
and feeding it inside like that, and pushing it up inside.
And I can't even imagine the kickback. The kickback on this rifle must have been extraordinary.
Absolutely.
And so the Germans are developing all these kinds of weapons. They're still using artillery, like you mentioned, flat guns. They're trying to combat these tanks physically,
Yes.
but they also have to combat them psychologically.
Absolutely, yes. What you have in the German lines is you have this tank Schrecken, tank fear. And it's not, as you'd imagine it, a fear of let's run away and get away from these. It's a whole thing of, it's a state of mind, I suppose. the commanders are saying, you can combat these tanks, you can stop these tanks, you just have to stand your ground and you must combat them. And they aren't infallible, there are weaknesses in them, and if you stand your ground, you can defeat these things.
It's almost like trying to get over, it's like a mental block in a way, isn't it?
Yes.
Once you get over the fear of the unknown, you know, you become used to these things. There are ways, like you said, they're slow, they can be taken out by artillery. You have got these weapons slowly being introduced, albeit rare.
Yes.
So there is hope, essentially, is what these commanders are trying to say.
Absolutely. The big problem for the Germans is the amount of tanks that the British are now putting onto the battlefield. Okay, it's all very well having weapons like this, but can you combat, you know, hundreds of tanks coming together in one attack? Not really.
In the early winter of 1917, any German soldiers that hadn't overcome the fear were in for a shock. Just under 500 Mark IV tanks were deployed to capture the town of Cambrai in the department of Nord, an important supply centre for the German Hindenburg Line.
By 1917, the German soldiers would have been more familiar with the sight of a few tanks rolling towards them. They'd gotten over that fear. But at Cambrai, the sheer number of them, accompanied by 1,000 guns, 8 infantry and cavalry divisions, well, it would have frightened even the hardest of men. With insufficient anti-tank capacity within its regular infantry units, the Germans were to suffer significant territorial losses, setting the precedent for the months to come.
Despite varied attempts to combat the new Allied superweapon, the tide of the war had turned. With increasing firepower, both in the form of tanks that were now virtually bulletproof and far more mobile, artillery and aircraft, alongside greater manpower with the introduction of the United States on the Western theatre, by 1918 the German army was facing imminent collapse. It was battered, bruised, and quite frankly, on its last legs. For many soldiers who returned from the front, the terror of combat never abated. Though the statistics are still fuzzy, at least one historian estimates that upwards of 20% of all soldiers suffered from shell shock, the early 20th century name coined in 1915 by the medical officer Charles Myers for combat PTSD. At the time, it was believed to result from a physical injury to the nervous system during a heavy bombardment or shell attack. Later, it became evident that men who had not been exposed directly to such fire were just as traumatized. This was a new illness that had never been seen before on this scale. The condition was poorly understood medically and psychologically.
My head seemed to be on fire on the inside, and it felt like it was burning. They have told me that I am suffering from severe Nervenschock, and my sense of hearing has suffered as well. I don't know if I can continue to serve. I do not feel right anymore. In the ears I can constantly hear the sound of Trommelfeuer, even though there is hardly any firing here. In the nights I dream the most horrible things, and when I wake up I feel dizzy. I will wait for a while, and if there is no improvement, I will have to see the doctor again.
In Germany, shell shock was not considered an acceptable diagnosis. Instead, those suffering from psychological trauma were simply deemed hysterical. In fact, some military leaders in the fatherland thought emotional breakdown to be unworthy of the fighting man, as well as unpatriotic. Accordingly, those who were suffering mentally were simply removed from the front line to make sure they didn't contaminate the morale of the soldiers around them. Following a harsh treatment regime, they were rarely returned to the trenches, instead put to work on the home front.
But those in command of Germany's armed forces were neither spared from the humiliation of its ostracised community of PTSD sufferers. On the 28th of June 1919, world leaders gathered at Versailles to sign what would become one of the most controversial peace treaties in history. The treaty's terms, seen as overly punitive by many Germans, would later fuel nationalist sentiments and contribute to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. The wounds of the Great War would barely heal before young German men would be called up again.
Geht aus Berlin, wir stehen vor der Infanterie. Granaten schlagen bei uns ein, der Franzmann will in unsere Stellung rein.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.